Chapter 15. Minding the Store. It was the early 80s. My brother Roy, ever the entrepreneur, had discovered an autobiography written by Stanley Marcus, son of one of the founders of Neiman Marcus, the famous department store chain. It was called Minding the Store. Roy was writing songs with his then friend Bruce Belland, who'd been one of the Four Prep singing group. They thought the book could be the basis for a musical, and asked me to adapt it for the stage. It was colorful and cluttered, filled with anecdotes and observations that encompassed several generations. It was hard to focus on a narrative through line, but as we whittled away at the material, we could see the outline for a cohesive story begin to emerge, with, we hoped, some memorable scenes. On one occasion, clutching Stanley Marcus's autobiography, Roy had accosted Stanley in the airport lobby and spoken to him in French. Roy had worked with Michael Legrand in Paris for several years. He charmed Stanley enough to elicit an informal commitment, allowing us to pursue the project. I'm sure it never occurred to him that he'd ever hear from us again. In due course, and after almost coming to blows on several occasions over creative differences, I have a vague memory of someone's hands around someone's throat. We had presentable outline with workable scenes, and Roy and Bruce had written some thoughtful, catchy songs. Roy called Stanley's secretary, Alice, who we learned held all the keys to the kingdom, and she eventually made arrangements for us to meet in Dallas and audition what we had. By now, things had already begun to take on a surreal quality, but there was more, much more to come. We took the cheapest flight we could to Dallas, and met Stanley and Alice in his tasteful, what else, office. He was immaculate, rotund, debonair, with a close, neatly trimmed white beard and expensive, flattering glasses. After brief pleasantries, we adjourned to a restaurant downstairs in his building, quite elegant and empty. Stanley obviously had influence with the management. For all we knew, he was the management. Stanley and Alice seated themselves at one of the small tables in the cocktail lounge, and he pointedly glanced at his watch. Roy made himself as comfortable as he could at the piano and placed his music on the rack. I opened the hastily bound libretto and took a deep breath, and we plunged in. I read the dialogue and narrative, and Bruce and Roy sang the songs when they occurred. They even let me join in on one of the choruses. We performed with as much passion as we could muster, and it soon became apparent that Stanley was surprised and impressed. Occasionally, he glanced at Alice across the table from him, gauging her reactions. She had been with him for many years. She knew the Marcus family and their history intimately. Our confidence and enthusiasm soared as we saw her wipe away a tear when we came to a particularly emotional scene. That night, at the expensive hotel where Alice had made reservations for us, we celebrated. We could only have been happier as Stanley was picking up our tab, but at least he had invited us to meet him at the store the next day for a personal tour. It would be hard to express our feelings as we walked into the hallowed halls of Neiman Marcus, the present-day incarnation of the store Stanley's father Herbert had founded in Dallas, of all places, in 1908 with his sister Carrie and her husband, Al Neiman, when they were all very young and very ambitious. Al brought them an opportunity to secure the Southern Regional franchise for a brand new soft drink, but they opted for the store instead. The soft drink was Coca-Cola. We had spent months reading and writing, talking and singing about it, and now Stanley himself, having grown up with the store, was showing us through his luxurious pride and joy. He was painstaking in his descriptions as he led us from one department to another. He seemed to be especially enthusiastic when we came to the furs, where a gracious saleswoman nearly fell over herself welcoming us. Undoubtedly, Stanley's obvious pride had something to do with his father, Herbert, whose daring, those many years ago, introduced furs from Europe and New York to the women of Dallas. We knew from our research that Herbert had been an enormous influence on his four sons. In fact, that's what we'd written about. We auditioned again in Stanley's home for family and friends after chili was served, not without ceremony. Another significant step, we thought, as we received what appeared to be an appreciative response. The fact that the family seemed to accept our fictionalized version of their lives, warts and all, was especially gratifying. But the material was still in rough shape, and maybe everyone was just being polite. Armed with a more formal agreement from Stanley, his tacit approval, and yet another revised script, fresh from the typist, we journeyed to New York with our wives to make the rounds of Broadway producers. The trip was the source of an enormous blow-up between Roy, Bruce, and me. They wanted to take the show to New York immediately, and I wanted to first try it out in regional theater so we could refine and polish. Even Neil Simon had begun to do that, but I was outvoted. These things take time. Martin Charnin spent 10 years getting Annie off the ground, and it took Meredith Willson 11 with Music Man. Kirk Douglas owned the rights to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest for many years, but was too old to play the lead by the time his son Michael managed to produce the award-winning film with Saul Zaentz. With little money between us and barely serviceable credit cards, we settled into the Algonquin Hotel. Small, somewhat seedy and run down, but the legendary meeting place of theater elite. Deborah's and my tiny room had a slanted floor and considerable mold. We mostly slid our way into the abominable bathroom. The wives saw the sights and window shopped while we kept the handful of appointments our recently acquired manager had arranged, having undoubtedly called in favors in the process of selling 3 New York tyros, virtual amateurs. We sang and pitched our brains out to preoccupied producers, reps in sterile rooms, returning to the hotel after each meeting increasingly discouraged about our chances of storming Broadway. And to cover our disappointment, we joked and laughed a lot, excessively, once disrupting activity in the staid coffee shop for several minutes with gales of laughter, when, as only he can, Roy hilariously described his encounter with the obstreperous toilet the night before. As only he can, Roy hilariously described his encounter with the obstreperous toilet the night before. Almost 10 years elapsed. We had each gone separate ways. Roy now had his own theater, the Sea Coast Rep in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, characteristically persistent. He wanted to produce Minding the Store. Bruce and I became re-energized by Roy's persuasive enthusiasm. We began revising, rewriting, arguing again. I worked in Portsmouth with Roy for a time, and Bruce joined us when he could. While he was in L.A., there was much phoning and mailing back and forth. In time, we thought at long last we had the making of a show. Dates were arranged, announcements and invitations went out. Then sets and casting and rehearsals. Deborah was going to be there, and my father, with my daughter Susan and her soon-to-be husband John. I wish my mother had lived to join them. Then Stanley Marcus advised that he would be coming from Dallas with his wife. His brother Larry, one of the brothers we'd written about so carefully, there had been much sibling rivalry between them after the story's founders died, and a niece and a nephew or two. I sat behind the Marcus contingent during the premiere performance, watching for any revealing change in head movement or body position as they experienced their lives unfolding before them on stage. But my attention was primarily fixed on our music and words. So far as I can tell, no one in the audience threw up or walked out. Roy had arranged a lavish reception afterwards for cast, crew, and invited guests. The Marcuses came, and for a family that was clearly undemonstrative, they seemed cordial. Stanley, tired, but game, received well-wishers like royalty, seated at a table and signing copies of his book. The cast mingled among the family, exchanging greetings, but it was still hard for us to tell how the Marcuses really felt about the evening's proceedings. I did witness one exchange that might have been a clue when I introduced Stanley's brother Larry to the actress who played Minnie, his mother. As they shook hands, he kept hers for a minute, and I heard the reserved, dignified Larry say, "Hi, Mom." 10 years dissolved into that instant, and it was all worth it.